Hi friends, I'm back with another video. This time I'm going to talk about the entity framework core, uh, having the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, and get operations with the SQL Server database. So this is the fifth video I'm making on the clean architecture for the .NET Core Web APIs, especially on the microservices architecture. Prior to this, I have made a couple of videos. I'll just quickly go through those. The first video was about the basic fundamentals on the clean or the onion architecture. And in the second video, I have actually created the project structure for the onion or the clean architecture. And in the third chapter, I discussed the all the basic, the foundation required for the API. So I call it as the API configuration. For example, the auto mapper and what are the settings required in the startup or the program file, creating the some of the best, following some of the best practices, creating some of the files, logging, having the service extensions and dependency injection, Swagger, routing, nlog API versioning. So these are the kind of API configurations discussed in chapter 3. And in the last video, I have discussed about the Azure Key Vault, especially for the security purpose. Where do you save your database connection strings or the password secrets? So those are discussed in the last video, and also discussed the API health check, which is really fun part. And now I'm going to focus on the entity framework core with the SQL Server. So before I begin, I just wanted to mention that I'm planning to continue this journey to make the clean architecture really following all the best practices, all the industry standard best practices. The goal is make sure that the project structure I'm creating here as part of this journey is actually going to be very useful in your real life applications. This is not just for kind of hello world kind of application. So it is actually going to be implemented in the real life applications. So let me begin what exactly we will be discussing as part of the, so this is my another video I will be planning to make it in the next. So the goal is this clean architecture will be created with all the best practices, and then use the Azure DevOps for the pipelines, and then host it in the Azure, including the Azure App Services and the SQL Server. So let me focus on the entity framework core in this video. So as part of the entity framework core, this is my agenda. I'm going to create the actual database project so that I can host my database. I'm going to isolate the database from the API code. Normally we can mix with the API code, which is like code first approach. So we have code first approach and the database first approach. So I'll be focusing on the database first approach so that the approach works for the existing databases, also for the new databases. I will also tell you the reason why I would go for the database approach compared to the code first approach. So the database first approach gives the complete control to the DBS. If you are creating your database using the model first, and you are creating the model or a migration and publishing from here, so that means the C# backend developer have a control on the database. So in that case, it is not giving an option to the DBS to control the database. So I'm going to create a separate database project and automate the database project. And if you are making any additional changes, we will be making that in the database project. So we'll be using the Docpack deployment through the Azure DevOps and hosting that in the Azure SQL Server. So that's the ultimate goal of this database project. So I will also isolate that completely from the API code. So I have to create a new branch, new repo for the database project, and then I will create the folder structure just like in the SQL Server. We have the folder structure, tables, views, and then stored procedures, etc. So I'm going to create the exact same folder structure in the database project and publish from there. So locally, I can publish from the Visual Studio, but this is going to be automated using the Azure DevOps. And then coming back to the API, I'm going to follow all the best practices to create the get feedbacks. That's what I'm working on right now, the feedback service. Get feedback by ID, and then delete feedback, also the create feedback, delete feedback, etc. So I'm going to create all these API endpoints. I'm going to follow all the API best practices. So I'm going to discuss those best practices also as part of the call. So let's begin creating the database. In order to create the database, I am going to use my database, the GitHub, and I will create the new Git repo. So the database project name, the Git repo name will be, I will use the same name. So I will say feedback database. The other database name is the feedback service, and this is for the feedback database. So let me create the database. So by default, the main branch along with this README file is available now. So I'm going to clone this code. In order to clone this, I'm going to use the git clone command. So let me first create the clone this using the git cmd. So I'm going to use the git clone and the path where the database git repo located, and then B for branch from the main. I'm going to clone into this branch. So let me see if this works. Yeah, so this cloned into the branch. Now I'm going to see how that looks like. So this is how it came into the physical path. Now, since this is cloned, the next step is to create the database project. In order to create the database project, I'm going to use the Visual Studio 2019 and then select the create new branch. I will be searching for the database project. So that's the SQL Server database project. So I click on next, and I'm going to call this as feedback database. That's my project name, and I'm going to keep that in the here, and then please place the solution and the project in the same directory, so that should be fine. Now let me create the project. So once the project is created, you will not have any files or the folders in this project by default. So let me make sure I can build this. I'm surprised it didn't pick up the Git repo. So let me see if this is created here. Yes, I can see that inside the database, I can see one more database project. So I basically wanted outside. So let me close this and then copy the files outside and then delete this. Let me again open the project. So this time open the solution, repos, feedback database, and this is my solution. I'm sure this should pick the Git repo. So now I can see there are all these files ready to commit. So what I'm going to do is I will, before commit, I want to make sure that I will be adding the gitignore and gitattribute file so that I'll not be committing all the folders, the files which are not required. So I already have the gitignore and git attributes file in the service project. So I just copy paste here so that it will select only the required files for the commit. Now, this is how my project looks like. I'm going to create the database tables in this file. So I need a folder called, I'm going to add the folders, just like we see here it in the database. So I will have the database tables, and then I can add views. Then I can also add functions, stored procedures. These are my functions. And then I'm going to add stored procedures. I'm also going to keep the lookup data. So I will explain why I'm creating this lookup data. So normally, most of the time, or like, you might have some tables with the static data, kind of enum tables. So those are going to be placed here. The lookup data scripts will be placed here, and those will be running when you are deploying the projects. And I'm going to use the merge SQL merge into statement so that the script will be updated, inserted, deleted properly. So I'm going to explain that. Let me first create the folder structure. So I also need the change script folder because I might be creating the change scripts for when I'm running the projects for the long run. So I have functions, views, stored procedures, tables, all these functions. Along with that, I also need two more files. Those are actually, let me add new, for the post-deployment script and the pre-deployment script. So the post-deployment script basically used for inserting the static data, and the pre-deployment is basically going to be used for change scripts. So let me add the pre-deployment also. So you need to select the SQL Server and user script, and then you can add the pre-deployment script. So I'm going to leave it the same name as which is created by default. So I make sure that this is building correctly. Now, what I have to do is I have to create the database table called feedback, just like I have created already here. I'm going to show this. So this is the actual table I'm going to create under the feedback database. So let me create a table here, add new table. So I can call it as a feedback. So by default, just the primary key is added here. So I've already created the script for this. I'm just going to reuse that script to create the table. So I'll keep the plural name. You can, again, this is a debatable topic, whether you want to keep it as a singular or a plural. So I'll leave it for the plural. I'll prefer to have the plural in the database side. And ID is the primary key. I'm also going to have the subject message, just like in the backend service, when I created the entity framework repository. In the entities, I have this entity object like primary key, which is the key, subject message, rating, created by, created date. So these are the properties I will be using for in the table. And this is my primary key constraint, like pk underscore feedback, the table name and the ID. So this is going to be the identity and increase by 1. Here I'm declaring integer, but you can also have the big int. So again, the difference between the int and the big int is a 32-bit, 2 raised to 32, and big int is 2 raised to 2 exponential to 64. So depending on the need, you can either declare as a big int or the int. So for me, the int works, but like, for example, this feedback, I don't think it is going to be 2 raised to 32 more than that. So, but if you feel that if you want to have the begint, feel free to use the begint. Begint C# equivalent is going to be the long. So make sure that in the C# when you are declaring the primary key, you should be using the long instead of the int. So again, if you know prior to creating the database table, how big is your table size is going to be, then accordingly we'll be creating that. So the next one is I'm creating the var char. So the subject, I just wanted to leave it to 100 and the message max. And then these are the ratings and created by default. The record will be system, and then this is the created date. So this is my table. Table is ready now. And when I plan to deploy, I also wanted to keep some lookup data in this table, just like I have these entries inserted into the database. So for that, I'm going to use the lookup data. So I will add a script here, and I can name this as the dbo dot feedbacks dot data. So this script is going to be called in the post deployment script. So let me first create this script. So I've already created that script before this. I'm just going to copy paste and explain this. So this is my lookup data, kind of enum data. So prior to reloading some of the seeding the data. So I have ID, subject, and these are the columns, and this is my data. So I'm using the SQL margin to statement, and this is my target, for example. This is how the syntax look like for the using into, and in comparing if there is already a data exist for this particular ID. If it is matches, then update the rows, else insert the rows, and this is how the script looks like. So I've entered 4 records. So on the post deployment, once the database is created, I'm going to seed this data. So in order to seed this data, this is a syntax. So you need to have this format here. So I'm going to use that lookup and the script file name. So I call it as the dbo.feedbacks.data.sql. That's my script file name. And so when I create the stored procedure here, that will be part of the stored procedures deployment. So that will automatically come. So I'm going to discuss those details later. The stored procedures, views, and the script. Just for the CRUD operations, I just wanted to keep a table along with the data in the database, and then I will be expanding this database structure later part. So make sure this is working as expected. So let me see if I need anything else. So I'm also, just for the fun, I'm going to create one more file in the change script folder. So let me keep that in the change script folder. I just copy pasted the one of the change script to keep that here. So let me add that in the projects. Okay, now I have a change script file, and that change script file is going to call in the pre-deployment. So let me open the pre-deployment, and this is my change script file. So right now I'm not executing this change script, but just keeping as a template so that we are going to talk about this in the next subsequent discussions. So for now, what I have is the table, and this table along with some basic data. This will be inserted into the database when I'm actually creating or publishing the database. So I see there are some errors. Let me see that's in the post deployment. So let's rebuild. So let's rebuild the solution again. So the issue is actually, even though it shows here, looks like the issue is here. That's related to the file actually trying to build it. So let me select not to build that. Okay, so yeah, when I copied the change script file, I got that error. So let me not focus on the change script for now. So I have created this. I'm going to publish this database. So I will have to select the server. So this is my local SQL Server database. So this is the Windows authentication. I would like to use the database as the feedback and then see so test connection working. So these are the advanced settings. So I can also have the connection string saved so that in case if required, I'm going to use that. Then click on OK. So the database name is going to be feedback, and this is my published script. So when you click on the advanced, if you face any issues, you can always click on this to recreate the database. So since I'm creating this for the first time, so that should not be an issue. So let's see if this works as expected. So it's trying to, yep. So this is green, creating the publishing preview, creating the database script, executing. So these are completed successfully. If I go to the database now, refresh the databases, I should be able to see the new database with the table, the feedback, and also the data. So this is the data I have updated in the database projects. So for now, this is all I need from the database project. As I mentioned, I'm going to use this database and automate this using the Docpack deployment in Azure DevOps and deploy this to Azure SQL Server in the later part. For now, to continue on the service part, to create the CRUD operations using this particular table and this data. So I'm going to insert more entries, read the data, get all feedbacks, get feedback, delete feedback, and also update feedback. So those are the API endpoints I'm going to write. Before that, let me commit this change. Database project template added along with SQL table and published from VS 2019. So just to review once again, this is something I'm going to use that later, and this is my lookup data using the SQL merge into statement, and this is my actual SQL table. So in the future, if I want to update this column, for example, or rename the column name, so I can use the SQL change script, and I can also modify that here. And this is going to use the pre-script and pre-deployment and post-deployment files for deploying. So I committed this. This is all I need from the database. Now I will shift my focus into the feedback service and start creating the CRUD operations using this database table. Before I begin the service part, I would like to isolate the code by creating the different branch. So let me create the new branch, feature hyphen entity framework. So my main branch has all the latest code. So now I will also push this code and then continue working on that. So the code is now should be in the server. Now let me make sure whatever I have. So far I have written the get all feedbacks. So let's go into the controller. Under feedbacks controller, I have get all feedbacks. This will call the service, and the service will call the repository, and my repository has a repository method which is going to get the data from the feedbacks. So in the initially I was actually feeding the data, so this is not required anymore. So I can commit this change, comment this code so that I don't need this, because since I have created the database and in my DI I'm actually using the database and I commented the in-memory one, so I don't need 2 lines here. So let me, now since the database is connected, I also commented the seed feedbacks. Now I should be getting the data from the database if everything works as expected. So let me also look at the database connection string before I hit the database. So let me see app settings development. So this is connecting to my local database. So this is my service. Let's get the feedbacks. Now I see all these feedbacks are coming from the database because I commented the code just to be a proof. Let's edit and add another row to see if this is going to still work. So I'm going to save this. And then I see the additional row here. If I try to get that, I should be able to get that. So that means that is coming from the database. Now the database connection string is working as expected. So I can add the new operations here. So earlier I have only the get all feedbacks. I'm going to start from the bottom to the top for adding the remaining API endpoints. In one of my video, I discussed the flow. I will just repeat again the API request flow. The request flow starts from the browser. The request goes to the controller. Controller passes the request to the service. And now from the service, you could have the external service or you could have the repository. So this is my API layer. This is my core layer. This is my infrastructure layer. So in the infrastructure, I can go to the external to get the data, or I can go to the database to get the data. And then the reverse flow, I'm going to map that the data which I got it from the database or the external service back into the DTOs, and then apply some business logic filtering all that if there is any in the core layer, and then also handle the exceptions. I'm handling the exceptions here in the controller layer, and then return the response back into the browser. So that's the browser or the consumer. So that's the flow of the API request. It's going to be the same here. If I debug here, this is my controller, and the request goes into the service. The service calls the repository. And this is all strictly following the dependency injection patterns. So here I have, if I want to add a new method, for example, get feedback by ID, I will start from the infrastructure and then go to the bottom to the top. So let's review again all these methods, whether they are these abstract methods are still accurate. So I've created these in the while part of the project structure. So the get all feedbacks required, and which is going to return the enumerable of feedback. Get feedback by ID will be returning the feedback by getting the feedback ID, and then create feedback. I want to return the feedback information, and this should be the core models feedback, and this is yeah, that's the create feedback, and the delete feedback will return the status whether it is deleted or not. And then I'm also going to add one more endpoint called update feedback. So update feedback required the ID and also the feedback. And this is again returns the Boolean property. So if I go to the caller, which is my repository, I'm going to finish that implementation for the update also so that I won't get the error. So I will call this as the update feedback, which is going to be feedback. And return type is again Boolean, so I will implement that later. So that's still giving the error because I changed the create feedback return type. So that's why I'm getting the error. Now that should be fine, but the caller again will have will make a noise. So the caller for this, the repository is the service. So let me go to the service and update the code. So in my core, I have the interfaces, and the interfaces I have the feedback, create feedback. So I will also going to add update feedback return type Boolean. I need feedback. I'm just correcting the definition so that I will be able to complete the implementation. So in the feedback service, just like a delete feedback, I need to have one more method for the update. So I call it as the update feedback, then feedback. So I will be implementing that later. So again, the create feedback need to be, so now this service is also fine. Going back to the UI, so I haven't called that method, so I think I'm fine now. So make sure that the code is working as expected. So I only added additional method update feedback and corrected the create feedback return type. Now my interfaces are good. I'm going to implement all these methods. Let's run and see if the get feedbacks is still working and are any issues. Since we have not changed the get feedbacks, that should be still working as expected. So just wanted to make sure that's working before proceed. So what I'm going to do is in the repository, I'm going to correct the code for the get repositories first. If there is anything need to be changed. So here, get feedbacks, first getting the data from the database and then straight away returning. So what I would do is I will actually do null check here, make sure that before actually trying to map if this object is not null. So that's the, and if it is null, then probably I want to return this as null. So same thing, get feedback by ID. I'm going to correct this method. So this will be, let me implement the get feedback by ID. So here, var db feedback db context dot feedbacks dot find async. I'm going to find by ID, and then if the object is db feedback is not null, then return the, I'm going to map that using the mapper, then feedback db feedback. So in case there is no data, it's going to return null. So this is my get feedback, and this is my all feedbacks. Now let me also complete the create feedback. I'll come back to the update and probably delete. So I'm going to work on the create feedback. So in order to create the feedback, I'm also passing the feedback DB, the core model. I'm going to convert that into the database and then add it to the DB context and then save changes. So let me convert that into the database. So underscore mapper dot map. I'm going to map into the entities feedback. That's my DBO model. And then underscore DB context dot feedback dot add async. And then save changes underscore DB context dot save changes async. I'm using all async methods, so I need await statement here, await statement here, and then finally return the feedback. So this is how my so create method will look like. So I'm getting the DBO model feedback, and then this is my converting into the entity model, entities feedback, which is my database feedback. I think I can add directly to the DB context. So I think both should work. Let's see if that works. So I can first finish the get feedback by ID, or okay, let me, yep. So this is all I need so far. Let me call these methods from the service. So let's open the service. So in the service, get all feedbacks I have written earlier. So let's start with the create feedback. So I'm creating the try catch in the one place, which is the service. If there are any exceptions, I'm also using the logger here and logging those if there are any exceptions. So I will just copy paste the, so I'll say error while trying to call the create feedback in the service class, and this is the error message. I would also like to deserialize the request objects, but I'll work on that later. Now I'm going to call the repository method here, underscore feedback repository, and create feedback. I have to pass the feedback method. So that's all I need. And this is related to the exception handling. If there is any exception, log that exception and throw that exception back to the caller. The same thing in the delete method. Again, try catch block. So I'll just copy paste and just keep the method name, change the method name. So here I'm going to return await repository dot delete feedback that accepts the ID as a parameter. And then I'm going to have the get all feedbacks. So this is something I used for testing purpose earlier. So this is a get all feedbacks. And then same thing with the get by ID. Okay, so return await underscore feedback, get feedback by ID. That's my get method, getting all the feedback, get feedback by ID. So I'm leaving the update and the delete. I think I have written the delete also. So let me call the update also here, just calling the method. So I need two parameters here. So I just use the control K and D, control K and D for formatting the contents, so that it is all formatted well. I'm going to use some analyzers later to format is better. So let's review again, get feedbacks by ID. I'm calling get feedbacks by ID. This is for getting all the feedbacks, and then update feedback. This is for delete, and then this is for create. So that's all I need so far from the service point of view. Now let me make sure that, yeah, I have this one. Let me go to the controller and check if I have. So this is my get all feedbacks code I have written initially. Get all feedbacks. This is the method. So I'm also going to use the name here for the consumer, so that the name will be used. I think I'm going to use this when we are actually consuming this in the React.js or generating the proxy using the nswag. So this is the name of the method. Okay, so I'm just thinking, is there anything need to be improved in this method? So it looks like this is fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another method for get feedback by ID. I've already created that. Let me quickly copy paste the code. So this is my get feedback by ID method. So this is my description. It returns the feedback. And this is my input parameter, get feedbacks by ID, and the name of the method. If the ID, I just keeping the validation. If ID is less than 0, not found. If it is greater than 0, try to get the value from the database. So this is calling the service method. There is no fancy thing. So I always make sure that the async operations best practices are followed for making it async. And then if the response is not null, then return along with the feedback. Otherwise, it will return the not found method. The same thing, I'm going to copy paste the create method. So this is the create feedback. Create feedback will be returning the feedback object, and then input parameter is going to be feedback. I think I'm going to use the primary key ID also, because I am going to use that ID here. So I will have to decorate that ID with the ignore, JSON ignore, so that I can use that part of the create at route. So this is the new syntax for create operations. So it takes the feedback as an input. I'm using the model validation, but I'm going to improve this validation by using some of the best practices. I think in the I forgot the name, so it's going to be the Fluent data validation. What is that? So Fluent validation. So I'm going to use the Fluent validation. So I will be replacing that later. For now, I'm going to continue with model state validation. This is out of the box with the ASP.NET MVC, .NET Core. And this is a new syntax. So instead of saying like this, I can say created by. So it is also going to display the new ID, which is created. So that's the create object. Now let me add the delete method. This is the delete feedback. It again returns the Boolean. It's kind of true or false. If it is deleted, then it should return true. If there is an error or something goes wrong, it will not delete it will return the false. So I don't think I need a model validation here, but I can keep the validation like if it is less than 0, then I think I can return bad request. So this is the feedback service delete method. I'm also going to add the update method. This is the update feedback. This returns true or false. Table used. So what we need to pass is the ID, which we are going to update, and the actual object which will be updated. So here we need to have the model validation. Make sure that we also have both the validations, and then finally passing the update feedback. So update feedback and delete feedback repository implementation is still pending. For the delete, we need to find the object which we want to delete, right? So it's going to be where feedback equal to await underscore db context dot feedbacks. Find async ID. So this is going to give the DB feedback. I don't need to call the DB feedback here. I think I call the DB feedback when there is a conflict with the input feed, the core model, but otherwise I don't need to call that as a DB feedback. So I got the feedback, and then check if that is not null, and then feedback. So delete the feedback underscore db context dot feedbacks dot remove feedback. So that's deleting the feedback. Then I'm going to commit the transaction. So in order to commit the transaction, so I have to save the changes and then return true. In case of null, then it's going to return false. That's the implementation for the delete feedback. And for the update feedback, I'm going to first get the feedback the same as this, and then do the null check. So let me copy the code, which I've already written, just to save the time. So this is, I think I can use the find async. Let's see, the find async returns, so it returns with the ID. So this is my DB feedback. If the DB feedback is null or the ID is not matching, return false. If it is matching, then update the DB feedback with the input data. And then I'm also create a date. I'm updating with the current date time. If the input is not equal to null, then update, save the changes, else return the false. So that's how the update script look like. Let me check if all the code is working as expected. So I'm going to test one by one. So there are 5 methods. So the first one, get all feedbacks, create feedback. This is a post. So I'm also following all the naming conventions. For example, the RESTful best practices, everything should be in lowercase, v1/feedbacks, and the API endpoint will have the plural and also have the v1/feedbacks. So this is the get all. Then let's test the, so if I try to pass 5 in the get, I should be getting the test data. If I pass 1, should be getting the first record. So that's the get feedback by ID. Now let me delete the 5th feedback. I'm going to pass 5 and that returns true. Go to the database, make sure that is working, and I'm going to create the new feedback with the post method. So let's test this. So there is an error. It says that missing type map configuration unsupported mapping. So I got this error. That is because it's trying to convert the core model into the database entity model, and there is no mapping. So that's happening. The mapping is happening on the create method in the repository method. So here, if you see, I'm trying to map. This is the core. This is the core, and this is the database. So the mapper which we created in the helper, my profile, this is only taking care of mapping from entity to the core models while getting all the feedback. Now, while posting, it should be vice versa. So we need a reverse map. So if we add that reverse map, that should work as expected. So what this will do is we don't need to write another line for mapping from model back into the entity. Rather, you can say reverse map, which will take care of that. So I'm going to post that data again. So I'll just say test this time. I'm going to say, yep. Now, if I go to the database, I should be able to see that. I also wanted to see the validations, for example. If I try to use the number rating 0, 1, I see the error. Invalid leading 0 before 1. So these are the kind of validations taken care by that model.is validator. So which is a really good one. So if I try to insert, I should be able to get that. Now let me update the fix using the update API endpoint. So this is my put. So I will have 6 here and try to update that. If everything goes good, so it returns true with the data which I have updated. So I can update back. That's updated again. So this is how the CRUD operations looks like with the best practices. So here, let me discuss some of the best practices before closing the session. So prior to this session, I was actually reading through a couple of articles here. Let me quickly go through those. So one of them is the Microsoft documentation for creating the CRUD operations. For example, if you want to create the get list of items, so this is getting the list of all the items, get, just like the feedback service which I create, I have same number of methods, get feedbacks. I've added the name here, otherwise the URL follow the same pattern. Get feedback by ID. So the request body is none, and the response body is going to have the feedbacks. So in case of create, it's going to be API slash create is going to be API slash the service name v1 feedbacks. I'm using the service name here, but in this example, they're not giving the service names. So request body is the actual item, and same thing. So the request for the create is going to be the feedback as a request object, and then a response object is also going to be the feedback. So I followed one of the couple of documents. So this is one of them, and this is the really good article on RESTful API design, 13 best practices. Make sure that you go through these. This is impressing that make sure that you never return 200 when there is an error. So that's where I find a lot of time. We spend a lot of time, returning 200, but there is an error. So make sure that is taken care. For example, the first one is learn the basics of HTTP applied to the REST, and also don't return the plain text. So it should be always application/JSON. So you can specify that in the controller explicitly. Avoid using verbs like, for example, generate banner. Instead of that, you can call it as a banner. So instead of calling create new articles, you should be calling /articles. And then try to use the plurals, for example, article/2, feedback/2, and return details in the response body. For example, if you say there is an error, invalid payload with the details. So I'm going to improve a little bit more. Still, I have some areas to improve in the some of the best practices. This is one of them. I'm yet to work on that. And then pay attention to the status codes to make sure that the right status codes are written with proper error messages. For example, this is a JSON with error message. Use the status codes consistently. For example, get 200 OK, post 201 created, for example. In case of put, it's a 200, patch 200, delete 204, no contents. So these are the proper status codes. Strictly follow the status codes. Don't nest the resources, and also handle the trailing slashes. Also make use of the query strings. So I have you in case of if you are having the pagination, so it's good to have all these query strings in the URL. So, and I'm also going to make another video on the authentication and authorization part for the API. So that will be discussed. The difference between the 401 and 403 will be discussed there. and make good use of 202. So I will be following some of these. I think I'm sure I missed some of them, but I'm going to strictly follow these best practices in the upcoming videos. But I try to make it as much as clean so far. So this is the working service. Um, I think I am pretty much done part of this chapter 5 entity framework core CRUD operations with the SQL server. So before closing this, just a wrap up, what we have done is created the new branch called feature entity framework to start the development so that all my code is sitting in the separate branch. I created a separate Git repo for the database project, created the database project, and added the database tables, published the database project from the database. So I'm going to automate that database project so that it is all automated. And then we created the CRUD operations. So get all feedback, get feedback, delete and update, and also create API endpoints. And these are some of the references and some of the best practices. Hope this video is helpful. As I mentioned, I'm going to continue this journey, adding more and more for making the architecture clean for the .NET Core, especially the microservices architecture. So far I haven't focused the microservices, but this is one of the small microservice. I'm going to add a couple of more services to give a flavor of the microservices, how the microservice architecture actually looks when you actually host in the Kubernetes in the Azure AKS. So that is something I will continue improving on my videos channel. So hopefully this is helpful to your projects. Thank you very much for listening so far.